The Bible was still warm when Eunice Calloway's neighbors found it on the gravel path behind her house. It had been burned from the inside out, the cover intact. The pages reduced to a column of black ash that held its shape for just a moment before the morning wind dissolved it. On the morning of October 14, 1988, in the farming community of Harlan's Creek, Tennessee, population 1,240, a church deacon named Gerald Fitch stood at the edge of Eunice's property and looked at what remained. He had knocked on her door for 20 minutes. Her truck was in the driveway. Her coffee cup was still on the porch railing, half full, a yellow jacket circling its rim. What happened inside that house in the hours before dawn would haunt Harlan's Creek for the next 31 years, and it would take a single fiber of evidence, overlooked in 1988 and preserved by accident in a county evidence locker, to finally give Eunice Calloway the truth she was owed. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to the beginning. Because to understand what was taken from this community, you first have to understand what Harlan's Creek was and who Eunice Calloway was inside it. Harlan's Creek sat at the edge of Cumberland County in a valley that the rest of Tennessee had largely forgotten about in a deliberate and comfortable kind of way. The town had one main road, one diner, one gas station that doubled as a bait shop, and a Baptist church whose white clapboard siding had been repainted every spring since 1951 by the same three families rotating the duty between them. It was the kind of place where the high school football schedule got printed on the front page of the weekly paper, and where people still left their screen doors unlocked during supper time because there had never been a reason not to. The fall of 1988 settled into those hills the way Tennessee autumns do. Slowly, richly, the maples going to copper and the smell of wood smoke threading out of chimneys from mid-October onward. Families were watching Dallas and Roseanne on Friday nights. Kids were wearing out VH tapes rented from the gas station. Younger men drove pickup trucks with country music cassettes jammed in the slot above the dashboard. It was a world that moved at its own pace, guided by its own rhythms, and most people who lived there had no desire to live anywhere else. Eunice Calloway was 63 years old. She had lived in Harlan's Creek for every one of those years. Born in the same county, raised in a farmhouse 2 miles from the house she now owned alone, she was a retired schoolteacher, 26 years of 4th grade at Harlan's Creek Elementary, and the kind of woman whose former students, now grown with children of their own, would still cross a grocery store parking lot to hug her. She taught them to read. She wrote notes home when a child had a particularly good week. She drove kids to the county library on Saturdays, 3 or 4 at a time in her truck, because she believed with a fierce and quiet conviction that books were the one thing no one could take from a child once they had them. Her daughter, Patricia, lived in Knoxville with her husband and their 2 boys. They had dinner together every Sunday by phone, a ritual Eunice had started when Patricia first moved away and had not missed once in 4 years. Eunice had a garden that took up most of her backyard. She grew tomatoes, 4 varieties of squash, and the best butter bean in Cumberland County, a fact she stated as simple truth rather than boast. She kept a Bible on her kitchen table and another on her nightstand. She attended Harlan's Creek Baptist every Sunday and had for decades. She was a woman whose life was built from small, consistent acts of care for her students, her neighbors, her community, her daughter. She had no enemies that anyone knew of. She had no reason to fear anyone. She always locked her front door. But that night, for reasons no one would understand until 31 years later, she had let someone in. The morning of Friday, October 14th, 1988, was clear and cold, the kind of morning that smelled like creek water and frost. According to records from the case file, Eunice had last been seen alive the previous evening at approximately 7:15 p.m. when her neighbor Dorothy Marsh had waved to her across the property line as Eunice brought in the last of her patio chairs for the season. Dorothy would later tell investigators that Eunice seemed perfectly at ease. She called out that she was making soup and that Dorothy was welcome to come by. Dorothy said she would another time. At 6:40 a.m. the following morning, Gerald Fitch, the church deacon, came to Eunice's door to drop off a canned goods collection list for the upcoming harvest drive. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again. The truck was in the driveway. The coffee cup was on the porch. The yellow jacket circled it in the cold. He noticed, as he turned to leave, the Bible on the path behind the house. He called the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office at 6:58 a.m. Deputies arrived by 7:20 a.m. They found the back door unlocked. They found the kitchen in partial disarray, a chair overturned, a bowl on the floor near the stove. They found Eunice Calloway in the hallway between her kitchen and bedroom. She had been struck. She had been there for several hours. The medical examiner would place the time of death between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. The burned Bible on the path was photographed and collected as evidence. No one understood it yet. No accelerant had been used. It had burned on its own, as if it had been lit from a single corner and left to consume itself slowly. A single page, partially intact at the very back of the book, was placed in an evidence envelope by Deputy Leonard Cathcart. He couldn't have known what that page would eventually mean. By noon on October 14th, 1988, the town of Harlan's Creek had learned that something terrible had happened to their schoolteacher. By nightfall, nobody in that town felt the same about their unlocked screen doors. The investigation fell to Detective Raymond Hauser of the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office, a 20-year law enforcement veteran who had grown up 40 minutes from Harlan's Creek and who took the case the way men of his generation took a hard responsibility, quietly, thoroughly, and personally. Records show that Hauser and his team initially focused on 3 areas: any recent dispute Eunice may have had, any stranger seen in the area in the days prior, and the burned Bible, which was unlike anything Hauser had encountered in 2 decades of police work. He called it deliberately communicative in his initial case notes, a phrase that would echo through the investigation for years. The first suspect was a man named Daryl Grimes, 39 years old, who had done odd jobs around Eunice's property that summer, and who a neighbor reported having seen arguing with Eunice in her driveway in September over unpaid wages. Hauser interviewed Grimes extensively. Grimes produced a receipt Eunice had signed, acknowledging payment in full dated September 28th. A second interview with the neighbor revised her account. She had misheard the conversation. The exchange had been friendly. Daryl Grimes was eliminated. The second lead came from a toll booth attendant on Highway 70 who reported a vehicle she did not recognize parked near Eunice's road between 9 p.m. and midnight on October 13th. A dark-colored sedan, older model, partial plate. Investigators pursued the partial plate for 11 months. It matched over 200 registered vehicles in a 6-county radius. The lead went cold. Patricia Calloway arrived from Knoxville on October 15th and stayed in Harlan's Creek for 3 weeks. She sat in her mother's kitchen. The bowl had been replaced on the shelf, the chair righted, the floor cleaned by then, and she told Detective Hauser everything she knew about her mother's life: names, relationships, anyone who had ever caused a problem. Hauser took it all down. None of it opened a door that led anywhere. By December of 1988, the investigation had stalled. No arrest, no suspect, no explanation for the burned Bible. Harlan's Creek had its first unsolved murder, and Patricia Calloway drove back to Knoxville carrying a grief that had no bottom and no resolution. Only the raw, sustained weight of not knowing why. The years have a way of folding around a loss like this. Not burying it. A family never allows that. But folding around it, accumulating the ordinary material of time until the wound becomes something carried, rather than something bleeding. By 1993, 5 years had passed. The case file at Cumberland County sat in a cabinet in the basement of the sheriff's office. The reward poster in the window of Carter's Diner had faded to near illegibility, but no one took it down. Detective Hauser had been promoted and moved to a desk position dealing with property crimes and traffic violations. But he kept a photocopy of Eunice Calloway's case in a manila folder in his desk drawer and looked at it periodically, the way a person returns to a problem they cannot stop believing as a solution. Patricia came back to Harlan's Creek every October 14th. She would go to the church where her mother had sat in the third pew from the front for 40 years. She would sit in that pew. She would leave flowers at the property, now sold to a young couple from Crossville who had no idea what had happened there, who had repainted the porch and replaced the gravel path with flat stone. The Bible's ash was long gone, but Patricia knew exactly where it had been. By 1998, her boys were in middle school. She had told them about their grandmother, not the manner of her death, but the shape of her life. The garden. The Saturdays at the library. The notes she sent home to parents. They grew up knowing Eunice Calloway as a woman who had lived fully and been taken unjustly. They grew up knowing that the person responsible had never been held accountable. By 2003, 15 years had passed. Hauser retired. He took the manila folder home. It went into a box in his garage that he labeled, in his careful handwriting, Calloway, 1988. He was 61 years old. He had worked 3,400 cases over his career. This was the one he could not put down. The house next door to where Eunice had lived had been sold 3 times since her death. The children who had been in her last class were grown and had children in grade school themselves. The diner had changed owners, but the reward poster, now under a layer of Scotch tape and with a photocopy taped beneath it because the original had become unreadable, was still in the window. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that deserved better. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, please take a second to like this video, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Your support is what makes this possible. Now, let's get back to Eunice. Then, in the spring of 2019, something happened that nobody in Cumberland County had anticipated. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation announced the launch of a statewide cold case Duna review initiative targeting homicide cases from 1980 through 2000 that had documented biological evidence in storage. Eunice Calloway's case was flagged in the first round of review. The call came to retired Detective Raymond Hauser on a Tuesday morning in April 2019. He was 77 years old and sitting at his kitchen table in Cookeville with a cup of coffee when his phone rang. The caller was TBI Special Agent Mara Stinson, 34 years old, newly assigned to the Cold Case Initiative. She told him they had pulled the Calloway evidence materials, that most of it was compromised by age and storage conditions, that the partial Bible page collected by Deputy Cathcart in 1988 had been sealed inside an airtight evidence envelope that had, by some accident of proper procedure, protected a portion of its surface from the deterioration that had damaged everything else. "There's a latent print," Stinson told him. "Partial, right index or middle finger. Someone handled that page before they burned the book." Hauser set down his coffee. "Run it," he said. She already had. The print had been submitted to the Tennessee Automated Fingerprint Identification System 2 weeks earlier. No match at the state level. Then it was forwarded to the FBI's Next Generation Identification System, a national database containing over 150 million fingerprint records. The process works by comparing ridge patterns against every enrolled record in the system, matching against the partial automatically, and flagging candidates for human review. On April 9, 2019, the system returned a candidate match. The match was to a man named Curtis Ray Belford. Born 1951, Harlins Creek, Tennessee, Curtis Ray Belford had been enrolled in the fingerprint database not through a criminal record. He had none. But through a federal background check submitted in 1993 when he applied for a position as a school bus driver with Cumberland County Schools. He had passed the check. He had driven that route for 11 years. He had retired in 2004 and was, as of April 2019, living in a rented house 6 miles from where Eunice Calloway had died. Stinson looked at the address for a long moment. Then she called her supervisor. By end of day, surveillance had been requested. A warrant for a DNA swab was being drafted. And Patricia Calloway, now 61 years old and teaching English at a community college in Knoxville, received a call from Mara Stinson that she would later describe as the moment the 31-year weight she had been carrying became, for just a few seconds, completely weightless. Curtis Ray Belford had lived his entire life within 12 miles of Harlins Creek. He had been, by most accounts, an unremarkable man, quiet, kept to himself, attended church sporadically, had no close friends that investigators could identify. He was known in the community primarily through his school bus route. Parents knew his face. Kids called him Mr. Curtis. In 1988, at the time of Eunice Calloway's murder, he had been 37 years old and living in a house on the opposite side of the valley. He had never been a person of interest. His name had never appeared in Hauser's files. But Mara Stinson, reviewing records with fresh eyes and 31 years of subsequent documentation, found something Hauser had not had access to in 1988. A complaint filed with the county school board in 1987, 1 year before Eunice Calloway's death, by a fellow church deacon, now deceased, alleging that Belford had made an inappropriate and threatening comment toward Eunice Calloway at a church committee meeting. The complaint had been reviewed, dismissed as a personal dispute, and archived. It had never been cross-referenced with the murder investigation because it predated the formation of any suspect list. The nature of the dispute, documented in the complaint, centered on a school board position. Eunice, as a retired teacher with community standing, had advocated against Belford's hiring for a district administrator role in 1987. She had done so formally, at a meeting, on record. Belford had not gotten the job. Court documents confirmed that a DNA buccal swab was collected from Curtis Ray Belford on May 2, 2019, pursuant to a warrant. The sample was processed at the TBI's Nashville laboratory. On May 17, 2019, the results were returned. The DNA collected from under the partial page of the Bible, preserved in trace amounts by the same sealed envelope that had protected the fingerprint, matched Curtis Ray Belford with a probability of 1 in 54 billion. The arrest was made on the morning of May 22, 2019. Stinson and 2 Cumberland County Sheriff's deputies arrived at Belford's rented house at 7 a.m. He answered the door in a flannel shirt and looked at the badge and looked at the papers and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, as if to himself, "I knew that book would be the end of it." He offered no resistance. He was 68 years old. He walked to the patrol car and got in. The community of Harlins Creek, what remained of it, the long-term residents who had been there in 1988 and who had known Eunice Calloway, learned of the arrest by midday. At Carter's Diner, where the reward poster still hung in the window, a woman named June Whitaker, who had been in Eunice's last class in 1975, sat down at a table and cried for 20 minutes. The woman who brought her coffee sat down beside her and cried too. Curtis Ray Belford was charged with first-degree murder. He entered a plea of guilty in March 2021, avoiding trial, and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He made no statement to the court. He looked at no one. He was 70 years old. Eunice Calloway was 63 years old on the morning of October 14th, 1988. She had spent 26 years teaching children in a small Tennessee valley to love books. She had driven them to the library on Saturdays. She had written notes home when a child had a particularly good week. She had grown 4 varieties of squash and the best butterbean in Cumberland County. She had called her daughter every Sunday, without exception, for 4 years before her death, and Patricia had answered every one of those calls. Patricia was present at Curtis Ray Belford's sentencing in March 2021. She read a statement into the courtroom record. She said she had been given back nothing except the truth, and that the truth was not the same as her mother's life, but that it was what remained, and that she was grateful for every person who had held this case across 31 years rather than letting it dissolve. She named Raymond Hauser. She named Mara Stinson. She named Deputy Leonard Cathcart, who had died in 2009, but whose careful habit of sealing evidence properly had preserved the one thing that solved this case. She thanked him anyway. The Calloway case has since been cited by the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation as a model for the value of proper evidence preservation in the digital age. The partial Bible page, sealed in 1988 by a deputy following procedure without knowing why it mattered, held a fingerprint for 31 years. That fingerprint held a name. That name held an ending that a woman and her family and a small Tennessee community had been waiting for since before the century turned. There are still, according to the National Institute of Justice, over 250 homicide cases in the United States that remain unsolved. Many of them have biological evidence in storage. Many of that evidence was preserved by someone who never knew what they were protecting. The question is not whether the technology now exists to solve them. It does. The question is whether someone will choose to look. Raymond Hauser, when contacted by a Cookeville newspaper for a comment after the sentencing, said only this: she deserved someone who didn't stop. He was referring to Mara Stinson. He may have been referring to himself. He was probably referring to Patricia Calloway, who had driven back to Harlan's Creek every October 14th for 31 years and sat in her mother's pew and did not stop believing that the truth had a name. What do you think it means for justice when a case depends on a single deputy sealing an envelope correctly in 1988? How long is too long to wait for an answer? And does the answer, when it finally comes, change what was lost? And what do you make of the burned Bible? A man who believed, perhaps, that destroying something sacred could erase what he had done. Leave your thoughts in the comments. This conversation is always worth having. Justice found Eunice Calloway after 31 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists, because the truth, however slow, does not stop moving. If you believe that, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved cold cases are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.